So I will today present some preliminary results of our exploratory project from in the Einstein Center Chronoi. The project is called Diglossia in Ptolemaic Egypt, and this talk is entitled The Temporality of Ancient Egyptian Diachrony in Synchrony. And on this title page, you might see one of the most renowned texts from ancient Egypt, the Rosetta Stone. And this piece had an adventurous material and a journey from Egypt, where it had been found by the expedition of Napoleon to London, where it is now kept in the British Museum. And as a text, it is literally a milestone for the decipherment of hieroglyphs, which Jean-François Champollion achieved in 1822. This trilingual stela, which is in its uppermost part poorly preserved, showcases a decree from 196 BC by a synod of Egyptian priests in honor of Ptolemy V. And the decree was to be issued, as this text says, in 3 different scripts. Let's see if this works now. Yeah. Which correspond to the iconic tripartite division of this monument. First, in the script of the gods' words, meaning in hieroglyphic script and using the idiom of Égyptien de tradition. I will come back to that shortly. Then in the script of letters, which we call demotic, and demotic developed as a cursive script and as a grammatical system in the 7th century BC. And third, the decree shall be issued in Greek, or as the text says, in the script of the Greeks, one of the official administrative languages of Ptolemaic Egypt. This so-called Memphis decree from 196 BCE is a monument to translation from two different linguistic and cultural systems, the Greek, Demotic, Égyptien de tradition, in a Hellenistic context. So from an Egyptian standpoint, this text in Égyptien de tradition was composed in a situation of diglossia, when hieroglyphic Égyptien de tradition was used only in religious and or royal contexts. Demotic is used from approximately the 7th century in administrative and literary texts, including also religious texts. Let us shortly look at the steps of that ancient Egyptian has taken in its history and the place that Égyptien tradition holds therein. So linguistically, we distinguish 2 major phases of ancient Egyptian. Its first phase Egyptian and second phase Egyptian. Old Egyptian and Middle Egyptian are in relation to the historical periods of the Old and Middle Kingdom, but without being totally congruent, and there are fuzzy boundaries to these stages, especially depending on which genre of texts we analyze. Now, in the New Kingdom, a major linguistic shift occurs with late Egyptian and the subsequent Demotic and Coptic. New traits appear in their written documentation. For example, the use of the direct article. Nevertheless, texts in Middle Egyptian are still being produced in high registers of language, especially in religious and royal context, in Égyptien de tradition. We therefore speak of a diglossic situation from the New Kingdom onwards, with late Egyptian Demotic and Coptic on the one side, and Égyptien de tradition running concomitantly. Yes? And texts in this idiom of Égyptien de tradition are artificial, meaning that they show the presence of very heterogeneous grammatical elements that do not come together in any synchronic stage of ancient Egyptian. This means, in other words, that scribal schools composing texts were filtering contemporaneous linguistic features as they are found in late Egyptian Demotic, but they also implemented others into Égyptien de tradition that they found in their contemporaneous chronolect. So scribes writing in Égyptien de tradition try, in very different degrees, to refrain from modern features. On the other hand, given a continuous use of certain forms, they perpetuate the use of anachronistic classic forms in a mostly monumental context. And thirdly, they revive expressions that belong to historical linguistic strata of the past and that are separated from the contemporaneous demotic, for example, by historical and linguistic breaks, as a sort of textual archaeology. That's a scheme that Andreas Stauder made up. So scribes composing texts in Egyptian tradition were thus linguistically distancing the text from their present by tying it to the past and foregone linguistic features. And the emerging variety of these linguistic norms in an ever-changing interrelationship between, on the one side, the contemporaneous language and the historical strata that are used as inspiration, leads to a plurality of Egyptian tradition, une pluralité, as Pascal Venus puts it. So that is why we might find theoretically any diachronic linguistic form in a text belonging to Egyptian tradition. And one individual text uses then a specific mix of these diachronical features, which makes him individual, justified by, so this choice is justified by genre, by text registers, by using specific phraseology, etc., etc. So this diachronical mix of a text has been used in scholarly debate to divide texts using Middle Egyptian features versus texts that use late Egyptian features, for example, and to date them accordingly as coming from the Middle Kingdom or coming from the New Kingdom. The problem of dating emerges especially with religious texts that have no date of composition. And very different are texts that have a specific historical background and they treat historical individuals like the reigning king or courtiers or private persons that we know. And these texts have to be newly composed, even if they partially use traditional phraseology, of course. So if we want to understand how scribes in Hellenistic Egypt treated, compiled, and created texts in Egyptian tradition, we have to start with new texts that have this specific historical background. And from the moment that we understand the linguistic norms of these new texts, we can start working on undated material, coming from the religious sphere, for example. And this is now the core of our Chrono project, to understand the diachronical grammatical footprint of historical texts in this diglossic situation, in order to detect common features and differences that pinpoint to linguistic changes and divergent scribal practices in the Ptolemaic period. That is why we use the corpus that is created around the Ptolemaic synodal decrees. And these synodal decrees, they are new texts that belong to a well-defined genre, the priests issuing a decree for the reigning king in return for his benefactions to the Egyptian temples and gods. And we use 3 decrees that have been fully preserved in Egyptian tradition. 2 decrees coming from the reign of Ptolemy III, the Alexandria and Canopus decree, and 1 decree issued under Ptolemy V. In order to evaluate their position in Ptolemaic Egyptian tradition, we chose 4 comparative texts that span from the 30th dynasty in the 4th century BC through the Ptolemaic period into the Roman period. And there are royal texts like the oldest one, this is the Hermopolis stela of Nectanebus I, and the youngest one, the Gallus stela, that relates the victory over of the Roman governor Cornelius Gallus over Nubian forces. And there are texts that have been produced for a local public in a temple context, like the Famine stela from Aswan, and 1 text of a private individual, this is text number 3, the biography of the priestess Taimutes on her stela. This text is dated to Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra. So in order to compare the linguistic features of these texts and to detect clusters, trends, and differences, we decided on using a quantitative and exploratory method, the correspondence analysis, which I would like to introduce briefly by using a totally non-related example. Pastry. So I imagine that you have witnessed how people all over the world started baking in the last weeks because they had nothing to do and they were afraid that there was no more bread in the bakeries. So there was no more yeast in the supermarket, there was no more flour in the supermarket. And having now a country full of semi-professional bakers, we could ask now a specific group of people how they evaluate different kinds of pastries, rating them 1 to 10. I'm sure no one baked in this time, actually. So let's compare puff pastry, focaccia, short crust, and yeast dough in respect to 3 qualities: taste, looks, and difficulty. So the core of a correspondence analysis is a correspondence table between two variables. Here, pastries on the one side and the assigned qualities, taste, looks, and difficulty. So puff pastry is related highly to taste in this chart. I assume because it is very buttery, while it is also very difficult to make. On the other hand, focaccia, you see in the picture here, it's looking beautifully, but it tastes just averagely. So the taste is really behind the looks of it. So then you have a short crust, whose most important quality, if any, is not to be difficult at all. Yeah? And yeast dough, on the other hand, is a bit recalcitrant. Is it too cold or too warm for the dough? But in any way, when it's working out, then it looks beautifully in different pastries, okay? So what correspondence analysis does is plotting these relationships between qualities and entities by using probabilities. And this is a very important notion. And these probabilities are calculated from the data that you provide. In other words, given all the data, it is much more probable that a puff pastry is more difficult than a short crust to bake. So the correspondence analysis shows graphically on a two-dimensional scale which features are close to each other and which are not. This so-called biplot brings together difficulty and puff pastry in the upper left corner, focaccia and looks, and at last taste and short crust on the bottom. But we see also that our yeast dough is not quite decided between taste and looks. Both are equally important for our review group. So by analyzing the graphical nearness and farness of our criteria to each other, we can infer how close or near they are in their properties, and if they belong to the same category of pastries, or in correspondence analysis, as is our project, exploratory. This means that we are plotting our categories on a two-dimensional surface, and this enables us to interpret it even intuitively. But this interpretation has then to be checked through the underlying data to see whether the chosen qualities are sound and whether the consequences are correct or not. So this is just a simple example with just 3 qualities that we compare. But what we want to do now is to compare texts and grammatical features, which is far more complex. So we chose to build this system on 3 pillars. The verbal system, the use of small particles that are prone to trigger specific verb forms, and the subject. We chose the verb because Egyptological grammars provide us with the whole diachronical evolution from Old Egyptian to Demotic. And as I said, every verb form is susceptible to being integrated in an Egyptian tradition text. So you see here 11 standard grammars of each Chronoi that we used, and the historically attested verb forms and particles have then been formalized in a code system with a stable ID, a code system that is diachronically structured. It differentiates whether forms are affirmative or negative, if they are active or passive. And we are now in the unique position actually to tag any Egyptian verb form in any Egyptian texts, no matter how heterogeneous this text is. So that means that the individual mix of these verb forms in a text makes them comparable to other texts, enabling us to build clusters of texts in respect to their common traits. So we have the code system, but how does tagging work? You see here a sentence from the Corpus decree, line 8. I quote, "But then the year of the low inundation occurred in that time," end of quote. We have one verb, this is cheper, to occur, to come into being, which I marked blue, belonging to the paradigma of a SECHMF past form. This has the code 108. This sentence has a nominal subject, which is code number 1, and it is introduced by 2 particles, Isaac and ref, that have the code 17 and 13. But we do not have any sentence, particle, or conjunction present, so we mark this as a 10, no particle. So now we have a numeral code, 10, 17, 13, 181, which represents the whole verbal structure of the sentence in a formalized system. And this structure is agglutinating. It is now possible to compare just the verb or just the particles or the whole sequence. We can therefore deduce the impact of particles and of verb forms according to these categories. The computations were conducted by Dr. Markus Weber. He is head of the research group Modeling and Simulation of Complex Processes at the Zuse Institute Berlin. And as an applied mathematician, Markus Weber specialized in analyzing the stability and instability of systems, namely in molecular chemistry. So with our project, he took a chance on Egyptology, and I personally am very glad he did, because I couldn't have done it without him, the computations. So, but he knows what he does. And so we can move now to the first results of these correspondence analysis. We'll first look at the verbal system and then go on to particles. And this is now the moment of truth. After you code all the segments, you translate the texts, you annotate them, and the resulting plot might yield no result at all, and if there is no system. But let's see. So let's take a look at these verbal forms. I have marked the points, or Markus Weber did, that represent our texts. The small dots you see, which have no marking, they stand for our verbal forms, okay? So the first good thing is that our texts adapt to a parabolic figure. That means that they are part of the same system, that they represent different stages or different positions on a scale. So in other words, the choice of verbal forms in these texts is not arbitrary. Second, the arrangement is not chronological, which can be easily seen by the fact that the oldest and the youngest texts are not at the extremes of the parabole, but they are next to each other. You see it here. Text from 29 BCE and the oldest text from the beginning of the 4th century BCE. Taking a step further, we see that royal and temple texts belong together, and we just have one eloping text. This one is a private stela recording the biography of the priestess Taimutes in the 1st century. So a totally different genre, but royal and temple texts, they belong together. And now comes the surprising observation, actually. One would suppose that the 3 synodal decrees, which are linked by genre and are composed in a short period of time, that they would also cluster together. But they do not. In fact, the first synodal decree, the Alexandria decree, clusters together with the Hermopolis stela of Nectanebos I, which is the oldest text in our analysis. And it is clearly separated from the Canopus decree and the Philensis II decree, so the upper 2 decrees. Moreover, between the Alexandria decree and the Canopus one lay just 5 years, but linguistically there are worlds between them. In other words, the Alexandria decree resembles more the Hermopolis stela than the Canopus and Philensis II decree. And this is surprising. And it is also highly interesting because the synodal decrees have been, as a group, taken as a homogeneous group of texts, they being a touchstone for new texts in the Ptolemaic period. But even they show different linguistic characteristics. So we can substantiate this by going back into the data. The 2 classes vary their forms on the one hand, and they use exclusive specific forms on the other. And this makes them separate. When the first cluster sticks primarily to Middle Egyptian forms, the second cluster uses forms that come from Late Egyptian or even Demotic. This tendency of the verbal system to dismember the synodal decrees into 2 clusters is reinforced by the particles. Here you see that there is a cluster of most texts, all comparative text and the Alexandria decree. And they are all near to one code, and this code is no particle. That means that all of them do not use particles extensively, and this is very different for the 2 later synodal decrees. They vary particles individually, but both show an increase in the use of particles in their variation within a sentence. So we can thus observe that here another and independent confirmation of our thesis that the synodal decrees work linguistically different. So I would like now to go a step further and to ask and to examine what cultural and historical context might explain the linguistic shift that experiences genre. Let me briefly sum up how a synodal decree works. So in its structure, it is a Greek honorific decree, a psephisma. And after the date, two sections structure the decree. The preamble mentioning the place of the synod, the participating classes of priests, and the benefactions of the king. And after having enumerated the good deeds of the king, the priests come up with a resolution, a decision that it is introduced by the phrase in Greek, agate tyche, with good faith. The priests decide on increasing the honors of the king, including new festivals, new regulations for the temple and the priesthood. And then new statues for the king and queen are meant to be erected in Egyptian temples, and we found some of these statues. And in the end, the recording of the text on a stone stela is decreed in Greek, demotic, and hieroglyphs, as I said in the beginning. So in the decrees, the priesthood, they appear as an autonomous entity in this text, and they bestow honors upon the king, which is a novelty for the ancient Egyptian relation between king and priesthood. Now, the Alexandria and Canopus decree are a reaction to conflicts inside and outside of Egypt. In interstate affairs, the Third Syrian War, a war that led Ptolemy III into the Seleucid Empire, where Ptolemaic offspring was denied the throne, was interrupted in 245 BC, already 1 year after it began, because the king was forced to come back to Egypt to resolve domestic conflicts. And we know from independent sources that in the 240s, famine ravaged in Egypt. We have paleoclimatical data that was studied by Joseph Manning in the last years, and it's fascinating results, showing how volcanic eruptions likely caused low rainfall on the Nile watershed, and thus resulting in low inundations in Egypt. And this can be now corroborated by the papyrological evidence and later Roman historical sources, which speak of a seditio or a seditio domestica in Egypt. And we have also a Roman papyrus calling this the Egyptian apostasis, the unrest of the Egyptians. In scholarly debate, this conflict of 245 BC as an agricultural and economical crisis is firmly established. However, the Alexandria decree does not mention it. It says just that the king saved Egypt from turmoil at any time, a phrase commenting on domestic and foreign conflicts, and it's a phrase. So, but the king, he gives amnesty to long-time prisoners, but not to newly made prisoners of the revolt. So we see that this Alexandria decree was decided upon in a heated economic, social, and military situation of conflict inside and outside of Egypt. And although the revolt seems to be resolved by 243 BC, the moment of the decree, it is very probable that the Nile failures and the low inundations persisted, because in 241 BC, the Third Syrian War ended, finally, with a peace treaty with Seleucus II, but domestic affairs still were out of order. So we have evidence for another famine in 241, and the Canopus decree mentions this famine as the year of the low inundation. I cited this section before. The king then has to resort to importing expensive wheat from Syria, Phoenicia, and Cyprus, which is for Egypt unheard of, because it's meant to be the place for wheat and harvest. So then, after the revolts, administrative reforms change the networks of power in Ptolemaic Egypt, especially in the temples and in the regional administration. The Canopus decree states that a new phyle of Egyptian priests of the Egyptian priesthood shall be introduced in the temple. And the Egyptian temple staff is traditionally structured through millennia in 4 phyle of priests, so 4 sections, and they rotate in their service month after month. And every priest belongs to a specific phyle in a specific role with a specific title. And this new 5th phyle now is to be called phyle of the 2 beneficent gods. So the Toi Oyagetai, this means Ptolemy III and Berenike II. And all priests that have been initiated in the first 9 years of Ptolemy III's rule, they belong to this new group. It is thus a young new generation that is enrolled in direct loyalty to the reigning king. And 5 of these priests, they are also members of the Council of the Temple with now 25 priests. And it is in this period that we find new leading priests in the temple, the so-called great governors. And traditionally, it is the first prophet, that's the name of the main priest in the temple, who is in charge of the whole temple as a leading cultic and administrative figure. And now, being first prophet was traditionally inherited from father to son. Now the great governors, they were not inheriting their position, as the private documentation from Thebes shows. It is quite likely that they were appointed by a group of peers, elected or somehow, or even by the king, but we do not see how this actually works in the documentation. So all in all, this shows how Ptolemy III tried to increase his influence on the Egyptian temple by restricting the temple's autonomy in matters of decision-making processes. And we can observe the same phenomenon with the nome districts. So from Alexander the Great onwards, we have these nome districts in Egypt that were governed by a military commander, the strategos, and an administrative commander, the nomarches. And from 242 BC, shortly after the first revolt in Egypt, whatever its extent might have been, we don't know that, the administration of this nome district is concentrated in the hand of one Greek officer, the strategos, exemplifying the increasing grip on the local hierarchies. But there's one last point I would like to make. This Canopus decree is famous for its reform of the Egyptian civil calendar, which is constituted by 12 months with 30 days, and there are 5 more additional days to it. And because there was no leap day in ancient Egypt up until that point, the calendar was moving each year a bit. And this changed with the Canopus decree. A leap day was introduced every 4 years after the 5 additional days. And this additional leap day was dedicated to the feast of the reigning couple, so they are strongly related to it. But actually, we don't see this leap day appear ever again in the documentation up until the Roman period, so we don't know if they put it into practice. That this is a matter of debate. So, on the other hand, in ancient Egypt, the annundation began with the rising of the star Sotis or Sirius. That means that when Sirius appeared in the morning, after a 7-day invisibility, the Nile was soon to flood the fields. It was a very important thing. So the rising of Sotis, it was perceived by the priests of the Ptolemaic era still as a sort of ideal new year. And these decisions by the Synod, in my opinion, led to the framing of the entity year in 2 different systems, the Sotis cycle and the civil calendar, by the reigning couple, thus emphasizing the importance of the Ptolemaic ruler couple for the maintenance of time in the cosmos, but also marking a new era, which was now recurrently bound to Ptolemy III and Berenike II. So now to sum up, after having analyzed our synodal decrees linguistically, a major shift appeared between the oldest decree and the subsequent ones. The shift can be understood on the basis of verbal forms and of particles, and it has occurred in a very brief period of time, just 5 years. I then try to contextualize this observation with political and cultural caesurae in the middle of the 3rd century. There is the 3rd Syrian War, there are Nile failures, there are revolts, domestic revolts, and there are new elites and new power bases that are being put into place, like the 5th Phyle, new chiefs of the temple, reformed nome administration. So all these points had a major impact on the stability of Ptolemaic Egypt, and this led to this restructuration of the Egyptian temple, the district of the nomes, and of the Egyptian year. And while these priestly networks and temples, where they were straightened out by distributing power to larger groups of peers, we might see that these linguistic changes correlate with new elites. But I cannot make the case for the attribution of this shift to specific groups, of course. But we see how the Canopus decree, which is different from the older ones, envisions the year 238 BC as a new beginning, new era, which is framed by the reigning couple in different feasts and by the probably, perhaps, linguistic choices the scribes makes. So perhaps our linguistic observations tie into this new beginning by distancing this Canopus decree from all the linguistic norms. Then I come also to end. Thank you.